Reed Maxwell. He's the McAleer Professor of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Princeton, where he directs the Integrated Groundwater Modeling Center. He works on the whole hydrologic cycle, from deep groundwater up to the land surface up to the atmosphere, much of it inside ParFlow, an open source model he's helped build that runs on machines big enough to make this audience feel at home. He has published 195 papers, was the 2020 Darcy Distinguished Lecturer, and is an AGU Fellow. Before Princeton, he was at the Colorado School of Mines and Lawrence Livermore Lab. We appreciate welcoming Reed here today, and he'll be speaking on advancing integrated continental to global scale hydrology through democratized data and ML accelerated modeling. So without further ado, welcome Reed here to follow on with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hi to everybody online. So I'm Reed Maxwell. Thanks for the really nice introduction. Thanks for the invitation to come here. Is it all right if I walk around? Okay. I tend to be a little bit more interactive because I get a little nervous. So a lot of authors on this work. I'll highlight everybody's contributions sort of along the way through. It's a big team effort. Science is a big team effort. I really want to highlight my collaborator we're about 50-50 co-PI, PI between us on the cluster of projects that makes up a lot of this work. And that's Professor Laura Condon, who's at University of Arizona. And then you'll see the team is sort of pretty spread between the two institutions, between Princeton and University of Arizona. So just to pitch a little bit the case for why I'm here or why we might care. So most of you probably know groundwater is our largest freshwater reservoir. It's 99% of the world's unfrozen freshwater, 50% of the drinking water in the US, half the world's agriculture. However, groundwater is not a bucket. Groundwater is really critical to environmental gradients. It supports ecosystems, particularly through the critical zone. It demonstrates really complex behavior. It's interconnected out to the continental scale. I'll talk about some work that shows that. And it's usually simplified in Earth system models and forecasts. So lateral groundwater flow redistributes water through the subsurface. And this is a really famous series of images. This is a reconstruction or a reimagining of the so-called Toth problem. This is Winter et al., USGS publication, where we see direction of groundwater flow here. But if we think about this as a cut through the stream, and we think about, it's easier just to wave my hands. The image that you see on your left is basically a side cut where we have stream valleys that are intersected by this cut, and we have recharge and discharge zones. Now, what's important about the flow lines are that they delineate some places where there's local flow, so-called hill slope flow to the nearest stream between recharge and discharge, intermediate flow where you might actually skip a stream, or this regional flow where you can actually have groundwater flow that's connecting many different stream segments or even many different watersheds together. And this is not new. The idea that groundwater is an important environmental gradient and provides a real subsidy to help shape landscape patterns has been shown in the literature or proposed in the literature for some time. My work with Stefan Collette in 2008, we had sort of this three-zone type approach across the hill slope where we might have a water-limited region at the top of the hill slope where the water table is deep enough to be disconnected, an energy-limited region at the bottom of the hill slope where you always have constant subsidies, where there's no water limitation to any plant processes or evapotranspiration or land energy processes. And then we proposed this sort of groundwater critical zone, or this groundwater controlled region in the middle of the hill slope where these small fluctuations might disconnect you or reconnect you to the landscape, and that might be really important for land energy processes. Now, Ying Fan in 2015 picked up that idea and tied it to root zone depth, where you have plants that might opportunistically spread their roots out where the water table is very deep so that they can capture antecedent moisture, because that's all they have to survive on. Plants that might have a bimodal or very deep roots to take into account the fluctuations in water table and use that deeper water table when they need it, or plants, again, that have a spread out root zone to avoid root rot or over water where the water table is shallow. So groundwater's complications are also really underappreciated. And I'm going to kind of walk through this, and I'll describe these two pretty well-known figures. So there's a range of paths and scales in groundwater, and this has been documented in a number of different ways. And a lot of that is because we think of water moving in the subsurface via Darcy's law. So we think of it as a very slow process, which it is. Water physically moves pretty slowly. However, it's easy to forget that there's also pressure propagation in the subsurface. So changes in water table, changes in soil moisture create changes in water table recharge, which will actually propagate pressure much faster through a watershed, through a system, through an aquifer than physical water movement. And so pressure propagates very fast, water moves very slowly, and this plus topography and land surface processes means that the system responds over this really wide range of scales. And there's now this real growing body of work that shows that these responses, these interactions are fractal or heavy-tailed or complex across a wide range of scales. And so this is Roy Haggerty's work on the left-hand side, your left-hand side. And that was published in GRL in 2002. This is hyperrheic zone work where he puts in a pulse of tracer into a stream and then understands how much that stream interacts with the shallow groundwater surrounding it, the so-called hyperrheic zone. And what you see is that this is discharge in time on the x-axis, and then this channel residence time, also both log scale on the y-axis. And we see this very clear heavy-tailed distribution. And this is small scale. This is a stream reach scale. We then jump to the right-hand side, and this is work that Jim Kirchner did. It was published in Nature in 2000. And what Jim did was he looked at small watersheds, and he looked at the chloride spectra in rainfall, and then compared the chloride spectra in outflow. So basically, you could think of the chloride in rain naturally occurring as a tracer. And what you have in the input is white noise. So this is a periodogram or in Fourier space. And so we have log, again, this is log wavelength on the x-axis, and spectral power and log scale on the y-axis. And if you have sort of a white noise or flat line, that means there's no coherent signal. So we have no coherent signal that's put in. But then when we look at the outflow spectra, we see that that white noise signal got organized by the watershed. So there's a low pass filter, and there's trending fractal or fractal behavior. So this complex behavior that is imparted by the watershed. So you put a white noise in, and you get a complex signal out. Now, the reason for that, and this is some work that I did with Laura Condon in 2016, and just to note, anywhere I have up in the corner, I have that little in-car. That's my reminder to say that thank you. This work was all on CISL computers. This was done, I believe, on Cheyenne, right? Because it was Cheyenne, Yellowstone, then derecho. We have applications of all of them. This was published in Science, and what we showed is that at continental scale, lateral groundwater flow subsidizes transpiration. And so transpiration, which is the amount of water that plants use as a byproduct of photosynthesis, transpiration is subsidized by lateral flow. What we did was we ran a model with lateral flow at continental scale, and then we turned off lateral flow and ran it in sort of a more traditional land surface model type approach, everything else being the same. And what you see is you see a shift of your transpiration fraction as a fraction of overall ET. And that shift basically pushes you outside isotopic estimates of this same amount. And this sort of allowed us to come up with a revised hill slope type conceptual model where we have trees that have deeper roots, have access to groundwater, they can keep transpiring for deeper water tables than your bare soil, which has a much more sensitive limitation to soil moisture. And so soil basically runs out of water, plants can keep going. We can also think about this in terms of water balance, and not only was this done on in-car resources, one of the publications that leads up to this is the Yang, Maxwell, and Valent was collaboration with CISL staff. And this was all done on GPUs. This was a Lagrangian particle tracking approach that was done on GPUs. And I'm highlighting kind of the end product, which is this Nature Water paper that came out a year ago. But there was a ton of work just to get particle tracking methods running on GPUs and a lot of interaction and collaboration with NCAR staff in addition to running on NCAR machines. So what we did here was we looked at tracing out all of the streamlines over the entire continental US from recharge to discharge point. So we traced out every single streamline over the entire US. And we were able to dive into this sort of local, regional type flow pattern, flow path. And what we found were that water balance approaches systematically underestimate your interbasin groundwater flow. And so we compare water balance particle to particle fluxes, so the particle traces versus just water balance type approaches. And what we found was that over the US, there's only 28 self-contained watersheds. These are roughly Huck 12 size. They're our own basins, but they're roughly Huck 12 size, so very small watersheds. There's about 15,000 exporters, which is just under 4% of the US, and only about 2,000 importers, which is about 6%. So most, about 90% of the subbasins are both importers and exporters, which means that they cannot be treated in isolation. They're a pass-through, and at the continental scale, as you move out to the continental scale, there's really no or very few self-contained basins. Everything is connected to something else, and usually that's because of groundwater. So we also find, and this is some work that Laura led, this was published in Nature Communications in 2020, that water table subsidies tend to interact for climate projections. And this is some work that was done to do systematic climate perturbations or pseudo-climate warming studies where we did systematic temperature increases of 1.5, 2, and 4 degrees Celsius over most of the continental US. And then what you see are basins that are colored by their aridity. So lower Colorado, Great Basin, most arid, out to the Ohio, Kentucky, most humid, Tennessee rather, most humid. And if we look at the sensitivity, which is on the right, so we're doing the sensitivity of evaporation, so the ET change per degree, plotted as a function of degree warming, so each of our cases, what we see is that our more arid basins are already tapped out. Right? You increase the temperature, you increase the potential evaporation, they don't have a lot of water to give. But if you look at the more humid basins, they're incredibly sensitive and they're incredibly susceptible to warming. And so they're the ones at the top, they have a much bigger ET change, they have a much bigger ET response. But then as it gets warmer, as you increase the temperature, they also start to move towards more arid behavior. So lastly, if it weren't complicated enough, the subsurface is super heterogeneous, and we don't have a really good way of characterizing that heterogeneity. And so this is just a geologic map of North America, and you can see a lot of the complexity, some of it by aquifer, some of it by surface geology. And so it's really hard to sort of understand and characterize the subsurface. Now, it would be great if we had a lot of data. If we had a ton of observational data for groundwater, then we could use that to try to understand the state of groundwater, understand how groundwater connects. And this is a product that is part of our hydrogen and hydroframe project. This is a product that's published every week. Amy Defnett, who's a research software engineer at Princeton, produces this. And I'm showing an example for water table depth conditions. We actually do a whole bunch, and we compare the current conditions for streamflow, snow, and water table to historical 30-year climate averages. And so we characterize them as below normal or to much above normal. And you can see this for groundwater. This is from a couple months ago. But what you see here is that while there may be on aggregate a lot of water table depth observations, most of them are a single to just a few observations, usually when the well was drilled, and they're not ongoing. They're not near real time. And this is the USGS near real time. There's typically a maximum of a few thousand, and often there's only usually a few hundred that are active at any given time. And so we're very, very, very underobserved in terms of groundwater. So what do? So what we do is we study the system with models. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by an integrated hydrologic model. I have some equations on the next slide. I promise it's my only equations. We use and develop a platform called ParFlow CLM. We solve 3D saturated, variably saturated groundwater flow. We have fully integrated surface water. It's parallel from the ground up. We have coupled land surface processes via a land surface model, land energy balance, snow dynamics. And for this model, we tend to drive it like a land surface model. We drive it by hourly meteorology. So it's driven in a sense, not like a lot of hydrologic models or not like a lot of groundwater models. We don't impose a recharge. We don't impose boundary conditions. We run out to a large scale to push the boundaries away. We spin the model up. And everywhere where we get stream flow, that water has to converge. That water has to create the conditions to create a stream. We don't actually say, oh, this is going to be a stream. That has to happen as a result of the topography, the conditions, the recharge, et cetera. And so coupling with land surface processes allows us to simulate these interactions and connections. So lots of equations. I'll just sort of walk through them really quickly. At the top, we solve a modified form of mixed form of the Richards equation. We're solving for H here. If you note, compared to a lot of forms of the Richards equation that you might see in a land surface model, they tend to solve not the mixed form of the Richards equation. So we do things a little bit differently. The mixed form tends to be more common, more popular in vadose hydrology and soil science. We modify it further, so that first term is a compressible storage term. That's actually a groundwater compressible storage that takes into account expansion of the matrix. And that's important because this allows this equation to collapse to the standard groundwater equation if we have full saturation, to act like soil moisture equation if we don't have groundwater. And then because of the way we apply this upper boundary condition, we switch on shallow water equations, which I'm showing is that partial of H and the del dot of H times V. And so that turns on our overland flow equations. And we have flux relationships either from a modified Darcy-Buckingham, which we've modified as a train following grid, which I can talk about if people have questions. And then we have forms of the kinematic or diffusive wave equation, which we solve. And so this system automatically switches between saturated, unsaturated, groundwater, surface flow, all simultaneously at the same time with integrated boundary sink source terms. So every time step, usually every hour or every 15 minutes, depending on the simulation, we are exchanging with a land surface model. So the land surface model is handling all of the surface processes, snow, land energy budget, plant processes, plant functional types, exactly like a standard land surface model, but it uses the soil moisture limitations from ParFlow. ParFlow then gets all of the recharge flux, all the ET flux in 3 dimensions over the root zone, which are then handed to it from our land surface model every single time step. And so there's no hydrology, there's no runoff hydrology, there's no runoff relationship in the land surface model. That's all handled by ParFlow. ParFlow has no land energy budget or plant types. That's all handled by CLM. Okay, so as the name implies, ParFlow is built to be parallel and takes full advantage of parallel computing. And so I'm showing just a bunch of different weak parallel scaling studies. So on the far left is one that was done on UQueen, which is a large IBM system that was at the research center in Jülich. And that's scaling out to roughly 12,000 cores. In the middle is another scaling study that was done to scale out to almost 250,000 MPI processes. And then on the right is the most recent one, which is scaling out on GPUs. And so in this case, we're actually scaling out to 1,000 GPUs. We've now scaled out much farther, but we see that we're maintaining not only good scaled parallel performance, but also on a number of different platforms. So, okay. So it's important to include, hopefully I've convinced you that it's important to include rigorous groundwater representation in our system models for simulation and forecasting. And I'm going to highlight a couple things that are coming out of this group's work. So advanced physics-based workflows and forecasts, emulators to accelerate simulations, data-driven groundwater mapping, downscaling approaches, parameter estimation, and then a case study bridging remote sensing and observations. So the first, okay, I have to stand a little bit closer for the remote to work. So we first started building continental-scale integrated simulations in 2013. The first paper came out in 2015, and we've had sort of this lineage, which we're calling CONUS 1 to CONUS 2.1 now, of our continental scale integrated hydrology platforms. And so I'm going to highlight some simulations from the CONUS 2.1 here. And so these movies, this is water year 2003. These are hourly simulations. I'll move out of the way so you can see. These are hourly simulations. I've daily averaged them, running them through the water year. So the slider shows October, beginning of October through the end of September. And on the left, we see water table depth. That's log scale. And on the right, we see latent heat flux. And so remember that because we're integrating, we're simulating all of these processes, we have a full land energy budget, we have a full hydrology, and we have a number of different variables that we could show. So if we look at the left, we see that a lot of different temporal and spatial scales and interactions. So for example, the first thing you might notice is antecedent shallow groundwater that responds quickly to antecedent precipitation, right? So we have rainfall, we get a lot of really quick, rapid, shallow groundwater response. That's also tightly coupled to surface water. But then if we look in the more western US, where we've got much deeper water tables, some up to 300 meters deep, we see more seasonal patterns, right? So we might see the snowmelt happening through the spring and early summer. Now, if we look at the right, latent heat flux has a much faster pattern. Of course, the first thing that we're going to notice is the response to radiation and cloud cover and the forcing. But then we see the seasonal cycle. And if you look at the seasonal cycle, you also see that there's some strong interactions with topography and water table depth. And this is something that we've documented quite a bit. Now, one of the things that we've been doing, and this is work that Leonardo Sandoval, who's a postdoc at Arizona, in collaboration with Amy, who I mentioned is a research software engineer at Princeton, we have been building workflows to automate the simulation process. And it's a pretty complicated diagram here, but just to sort of walk you through the big picture. So we have file transfer via Globus. That's all completely automated. We're moving, usually single to multiple terabytes back and forth for simulations. We have derecho, Tiger, which is a Princeton computer, and then TAC clusters that are all targeted for our simulations. So it's automated between the Princeton Hydro Data Cluster and the machine. And then we have an automated evaluation framework that we use to automatically automate. Now, this is a retrospective or near real time. Notice that we have CW3E forcing that we pull in, run through the full simulation. We also have this set up to run with GFS now. So we have a forecasting product now where we're running hourly, 2-week forecasts that we run in experimental mode every week. We also pull in USGS, SNOTEL, Ameriflux, et cetera, observation side so that we ingest all of these in the full evaluation process. And so what does the forecast look like? So this is an example of the forecast. This is also work that Leonardo and Amy are both leading. And so we can show that our integrated models are forecast ready. So we're calling this sort of our US hydrology digital twin. This is actually inundation depth. So just to recall that we're producing not only water table, but we also produce surface water flow. And so this is last week's run. So this is running through mid-June. And you can see that this is driven by GFS. We have hourly forcing, and we're running this out in experimental mode. And we've been doing the near real time for about a year. And we've been doing the forecast for about 9 months. So just an experimental every 2 weeks, proof of concept. But just to sort of demonstrate the utility and ability to do these types of simulations. Now, these are great simulations, right? I've shown you how much fidelity you have and the sorts of questions you can answer, but of course they're very expensive to run, right? And these simulations, this is just another image from the Nature Communications paper. This was done in 2020. This was roughly 6 million CPU hours on a leadership machine. That's not crazy, but that's not also in the hands of water managers or in giant ensemble mode or in such a way that we can really make this more of an operational product. So one of the first things that we've done, and this is work that Andrew Bennett led. He's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. He was a postdoc in Laura's group when he did this work. Andrew built a emulator, and this is a full emulator of the parflow system. And so on the left, we have parflow. This is our CONUS 1 water table depth. And on the right, we have the emulated water table depth. And the emulator is statistical. We're emulating the entire 3D pressure field, so we actually calculate water table depth. And of course, these simulations are 100x faster. And so they now unlock and enable a lot of different things that the physics-based simulation didn't. We've also been doing purely data-driven approaches. So this is some work that was published in Nature Communications, Nature Communications, Earth and Environment in 2026, so just in February. And this is a 1 arcsecond or 30-meter resolution water table depth product. So this is over the continental US. You can sort of see the detail here. This is work that was led by Yuling Ma, who's now at the research center at ULISH. Yuling was a postdoc in my group when she did this work. And we see that if we zoom in, say on the right-hand side here, we zoom in with an inset to 100-kilometer pixel at the top, which might be a satellite remote sensing pixel, down to a 10K pixel, which might be a leadership global hydrologic or global Earth system model, even down to a 1K pixel. We see that there's still a lot of detail, water table depth. This is all log scale, even at that very small scale. And we can not only use this to understand what the water table depth looks like, but we can also use this to estimate how much water is accessible over the US. And so what I'm showing here is we downscaled this to 100K resolution, 10K, 1K, 100 meter, and then the 1 arcsecond. And I'm plotting the total groundwater storage estimate here. So 306,000 cubic kilometers of water is our estimate of how much water we have in the US. But not only that, we can look at how well you might be able to make that prediction at different resolutions. And so we see at the 100K resolution, or even the 10K resolution, you start to fall outside the error bars of the high resolution prediction. Now the second piece is this accessible groundwater piece. And I'm showing very deep water, so water that's greater than 50 meters deep, medium, shallow, and very shallow. And I've kind of highlighted this shallow, medium range. That's the 19 to 39%. And so very shallow, less than 1 meter, that's directly interacting with surface water, right? That's your groundwater surface water connection. And you see that you really miss that connection at all below 1 kilometer, and it really starts to appear around 100 meters. The second piece would be the plant accessible water, which is less than 10 meters deep. And that changes quite a bit. So at coarse resolutions, we're not representing the amount of plant accessible water. We're not representing these connections as well as we might at 100 meter or 30 meter resolution. We can also use this downscaling approach as a bias correction for our simulations. And so this is some follow-on work that Yuling did. This was published in Journal of Hydrology in 2026. And so this is taking our CONUS workflow, where she has also used a very similar machine learning approach that's data-driven to bias correct and downscale the model simulations. And so what we have are 1 arcsecond daily water table depth estimations that are part of our whole workflow and part of our whole forecasting. We can also do this with surface water. This is work by Amelia Peoples, who's a PhD student in my group at Princeton. This is also work that is happening at NCAR, simulations that are happening at NCAR. And what Mia's been doing is she's been running a 1 kilometer parflow model and a 100 meter parflow model. And she's been training a random forest regressor to learn the relationship between the two models so that she can produce a 100-meter inundation map or 100-meter inundation output based on this learned relationship. And so she's done this. This is in review in Journal of Hydrology. She's done this for model to model as a proof of concept. And then she's now also got a workflow that does this with SWAT so that you don't even need the high-res model. You can do this as an integration of remote sensing. We can also do this forwards and backwards. So one of the great things about machine learning approaches is that they're differentiable, meaning we can run the same model forward or backwards. So this is work that Amanda Triplett led. Amanda was a former grad student in Laura's group. This was published in GRL a year ago. And what I'm showing is the hydraulic conductivity in the upper left, panel A, for our CONUS 1 simulation. And so it's the hydraulic conductivity map for our CONUS 1. We can run a forward model and calculate water table depth based on recharge, slopes, and hydraulic conductivity. We can also train a machine learning emulator to learn that water table depth map as well. What we can also do is we can train a machine learning emulator to be handed water table depth, slopes, and recharge and produce hydraulic conductivity. And that's what's in B. So in a sense, we can run the system backwards, and from a water table depth map, we can invert the input parameters. And then we can actually put those back into ParFlow and run it forward to see how well this represents the physical basis. And that's D is A into ParFlow run to D. B is the inverted hydraulic conductivity, inverted input parameters run through ParFlow into E. And we see remarkably good agreement. And this means that we can not only use this system to speed up models, but we can also use this system in these types of approaches in parameter estimation. And the next thing I'd like to highlight is a more traditional approach. This is Marijo Sama, who's a PhD student, PhD candidate now in my group. And we're using an approach called simulation-based inference. This is popular in other fields. We had a proof of concept paper in Hess on this in 2024, and Marijo is now doing this in real basins. And so what you do with simulation-based inference, it's a Bayesian approach where you have a prior definition, so you have a prior understanding of the distribution of parameters. You sample them, say for Manning's equation, for Manning's roughness coefficient. Then you run a number of forward simulations, and then you have a machine learning approach. We use a neural density estimator that learns the difference between observations, simulations, and the bias based on your input parameters. And then it can produce the posterior, it can produce the parameters that are most likely to produce the lowest match, a mismatch. And so what we have is an approach that actually, with as few as 20 simulations, can very accurately produce very, very robust Manning's roughness coefficients. And so to sort of correspond this with national water model type approaches or more traditional calibration type approaches is usually thousands of model iterations that you need, thousands of model simulations to invert parameters. And so this is the same approach, but it's because we've inserted the machine learning model in the middle is much, 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 much more efficient. Okay, so we also, as I've alluded to, have built a lot of data platforms. This is a plug for the HydroFrame platform, hydroframe.org. You can hit that QR code. And this is just kind of a landing page where we have the hydrogen applications and projects. We have hydrodata, which I'll talk about in a second. We have all of our ParFlow CONUS 1 and all of our ParFlow CONUS 2 simulations archived with examples and such on how to get them. We have a whole modeling tools resources where we have our short courses and things like that. And then we have subset tools, which allows you to build a watershed model over the US really quickly. So to give you a plug or a quick explanation on what hydrodata is, this is led by Amy. This is the largest, most extensive, continuously updated database of hydrologic observations. Every week we pull in stream flow, groundwater, soil moisture, snow, ET, precipitation and temperature. We QA, QC, and we have a completely public API, completely free interface that's both web and Pythonic. And to give you an example of some of the ways that we're using this, so this is an evaluation of, or benchmark of our CONUS 2 simulation outputs. And in total, we have something like 930,000 observation sites, which is like 2.7 billion point data records, and 1.2 million site years. And so we can use this for, I'm showing this for Parflow CONUS. We also do this for WRF Hydro, configured as a national water model. We now have experimental, we just had a hackathon, we have experimental plugins for VIC, and for a number of other different SUMA, a number of different other hydrologic models. And so we can evaluate multiple parameter states. So not just stream flow, we can do snow, ET, soil moisture, and water table depth. And as I mentioned, completely Pythonic, so you can hit that QR code, you can get to the hydro data API and web page. We have read the docs, we have example workflows, et cetera. Now, a companion tool to that is called Subset Tools. And so Subset Tools is a Python package that accelerates basically building watershed models over the CONUS domain. And so what this does is a number of different things. We have 46 years of hourly forcing archive from CW3E, 1980 to present. We have all of the static inputs that go into the CONUS 1 and CONUS 2 models. And then we have different model configurations already sort of prepackaged. And a user can come in either with a Python interface or a web interface, choose a watershed, choose a domain, and then very quickly be handed a working, completely set up model with forcing. And again, this is all read the docs with short course materials and examples. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is an example of some of the work that we're doing over the Upper Colorado. And in case you haven't noticed, particularly in this state, water is becoming a thing. And as most of you probably know, this is right behind the Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, which is in dire straits. And in fact, it's so bad you can see this from space. This is probably not nearly as new or different to the folks in this room as it is to other places where I give these talks. And so this is, of course, a NASA Earth Observatory image from July 2000, which is the time on the right there, which was the last time that Lake Mead was full. And we see the Hoover Dam as just one little pixel, right? Lake Mead is a giant reservoir in the west. And the current state is that we're at roughly 30% capacity. And we can toggle back and forth, of course, and see just how depleted everything is, which is, it's pretty dire straits. Now, what a lot of people are coming to understand, and this is a paper that Chris Milley led, that was published in Science about 6 years ago, is that precipitation, while highly variable, has been statistically constant over the past century. And so on the left, we see precipitation from just before 1920 to 2020. And there's a ton of variability, but there's no trend in the signal. Precipitation is basically constant. And what that means is that this isn't necessarily a drought in the traditional sense, even though this year's snowpack was dismal. 3 years snowpack was the best ever, the best on recorded record. And so what has been the case is that temperatures are increasing, and that's the plot on the right, which shows that there's been approximately a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures 1920 to present. And so it's important to recognize that reservoirs aren't just rivers, right? So 96% of Lake Mead's supply comes from the headwaters, comes from the Upper Colorado Basin. And warmer temperatures influence snowmelt timing and the amount of water that plants use. And there's been a number of studies that have shown that more than half the water that flows in the Colorado River is groundwater. So what we did, and this is work that Nick Jadala, who's a PhD student in my group, did, was he used subset tools to grab out the upper Colorado as a HUC2 out of our Parflow CONUS 2 domain. He grabbed that out and spun it up and ran it and has been answering a number of different questions for it. And this is all work that's happened on derecho, so we're incredibly grateful for the support. And his first paper just came out literally last week in Journal of Hydrology. I'm showing it there. And so Nick is asking some questions like, can we disentangle remote sensing? Remote sensing has been used heavily in the upper Colorado to try to understand trends, to try to understand these drying trends. And if we can disentangle these signals, can we run naturalized and anthropogenic type simulations to understand relative contributions? For example, can we run without groundwater pumping or with groundwater pumping? Can we take out the influence of reservoirs or put in the influence of reservoirs? Can we run with a 1920s temperature distribution, or can we run with a 2050 temperature distribution to sort of understand what these influences might be? And so this is what Nick has been doing, is to understand the impact of historical and possible future changes in water use and temperature on the basin. And so just to sort of, the baseline, so this is his baseline simulation, which is the natural, compared to the GRACE satellite remote sensing product. This is deseasonalized total water storage anomaly, so GRACE just sees the difference in total storage, doesn't know how much water is there, it just knows the difference. And there's a GRACE pattern, which will show up on the next slide. This is deseasonalized, so this is just the change. Total water storage anomaly is in centimeters. That's centimeters if you took the entire UCRB and average it over the column. So we can do things, and this is from his paper, like we take the UCRB total water storage, that's in the upper left, this total water storage anomaly. You can see GRACE is in orange, Parflow is in blue. Again, we still see a really nice match. But then once we have this nice match between the model, we can say, well, is that the right answer for the right reasons? So we can compare to observations, or we can disaggregate that signal. And so I'm disaggregating if we go from top to bottom, down to the spatial terrestrial water storage. That's the total change over the predicted by the model terrestrial water storage over the UCRB. And we see that most of the UCRB is losing water. Some parts of the UCRB are actually gaining water. And then if we look at the individual components, which is something that we've been very interested in, we have the terrestrial water total water storage anomaly on the top. Then we can break it out by soil moisture, because we simulate everything. So we can break it out by soil moisture, by snow water equivalent, by surface water, and by groundwater. And what's important about this is typically studies have disaggregated the GRACE signal using a land surface model, which does not have a groundwater component, and then they've always taken the deficit, the difference between GRACE and the land surface model simulation, to be the groundwater signal. And so we're able to actually capture the groundwater signal directly. We can also compare to observations. So at the top, we compare to a number of different products. That's OpenET, range, plus or minus 1 standard deviation. That's CBOP product, different slightly, because I know it's part of OpenET. And then our Parflow CLM. And then we also compare to the naturalized flow at Lease Ferry. We've compared to a ton of others, but I'm just showing you that we not only match the remote sensing, we also match observations very well. So we can do things like, as I mentioned, these counterfactuals. So we can say, well, what if we take water year 2009, which is pretty much a baseline year, but we give it pre-industrial temperature distribution from the UCRB. So we can use reconstructions combined from both USGS and PRISM reconstructions. We can rerun that year, and what we see is about 2 million acre-feet more water for exactly the same year than we would get in 2009. And just as sort of a cheat sheet, right? So an acre-foot is, of course, an acre filled 1 foot deep with water. It's roughly enough water to supply a household, suburban household, for a year. Lake Mead, when full, is about 28 million acre-feet. A good average of the upper Colorado is about 14 million acre-feet. And so if we look at what we might expect in 2050, 2057, we would see even another 2.5 million acre-foot deficit. This is just because of the temperature. This is just because of the increase in temperature. So it's really, unfortunately, more of a story of aridification of the system than it is drought of the system. So to kind of wrap up, what we're doing is we're building what we call this hydrologic digital twin of the US. So we've got our base physics-based simulations for CONUS 2. We're using machine learning approaches to downscale the surface water, machine learning approaches to downscale the groundwater, and to accelerate our simulations. And where we're going with this is to transfer what we've learned to the rest of the world. And so while we have our own water challenges in the US, they're nothing compared to the global south. And we hope to use what we've learned in this relatively data-rich environment to transfer these approaches elsewhere in the world. And this is really more of a collaboration or partnership. This is not us, sort of coming in. We've been systematically building collaborators and partners in other regions. And this mirrors other communities. So this has been done in many other communities, climate community, ecology, meteorology, et cetera. And so we're just sort of doing the same thing with integrated hydrology. So there's continental West Africa model. There's a continental China model, which I'm showing there, which was published in Hess in 2025. There's been an ongoing, long-standing EU Cordex simulations with PARFlow that's led out of Stefan Collette's group. The most recent is the NAS publication in Geoscientific Modeling Development in 2023. We're collaborating to build Amazon and National Australia models. And it's really critical that we have local scientists and stakeholders, that we're not just coming in, that we're people in the region. This is Chen Yang's group, who has built she's a faculty member at Yonsei University in China, and it's her group that's built the continental China model, that's collaborating with Chinese water agencies, that's really, building that regional, local, continental, local expertise. And it's really important. Now, just as a highlight here, so Maria Fleury, who's a PhD student at Princeton, and then a collaborator at Flinders University in Australia, in Adelaide, Australia, Dan Partington. So what we've done is we've taken the machine learning data-driven approach and we've applied it to Brazil, which you're showing on the left, and then to Australia, which we're showing on the right. And so these are just examples of how we've expanded this approach out to other regions, and as we sort of go piece by piece to get out global. And then lastly, this is some work that Stefan Collette's group led. This was published just a couple months ago in Journal of Hydrology X. And this is a hyper-resolution PARFlow global model. So this is a global 3D Richards equation integrated simulation, 1 kilometer resolution. And so it's running completely on GPUs, 3D subsurface structure integrated simulation. And this is just a proof of concept, but now that we know that we can do this, we know that this was within realm, this sort of is really a nice way to sort of identify next steps. So I see an exciting path forward, including groundwater out to global scales, inter-system models and forecasts. And of course, I think it's an important component of the hydrologic cycle. And even though it's really hard to model, I think we've successfully simulated it, both nationally and globally. And of course, as I showed in our last kind of study, we can advance these platforms and create opportunities to really understand the integrated hydrologic cycle to inform local decisions. And so with that, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or raise your hand online or put in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question that
Oh, actually, let me get you the.
They're using the ceiling mics for questions.
Oh, okay.
do you measure the evaporation rate, something like that? I mean, or you just derive from the temperature and.
So the question is, do we measure the evaporation rate?
Yeah.
So at my field site, we measure the evaporation rate using eddy covariance approaches, but are you talking about within the PARFlow platform?
Yeah.
Yeah, so within the PARFlow platform, we have a variant of CLM. So the same family of CLM that is evolved into common land model. They all evolved, 3 branches evolved from the same model in early 2000s. And we have a a full energy balance. We have plant functional types. We have all of the same, same processes. And, we use Medlin, Simel, conductance. We use Mononovikov similarity for, boundary layer evaporation processes. We have canopy, we have soil evaporation, we have sunlit shaded, all of the same components. And so we calculate ET based on our land surface model, based on conditions, and that is connected to par flow, meaning it does not have, the land surface model does not have its own soil moisture formulation. It gets the soil moisture every time step, usually hourly, which is dictated by our forcing. Sometimes for better resolution, we run a 15-minute, but typically it's hourly or sub-hourly. So that's passed to our land surface model, and then that is the soil moisture limitation, or plant available water, and then it, based on the forcing, so we have 8 components of meteorologic forcing that we hand it. We can run with an LDAS, we could run with AORC. We happen to run with CW3E because we've done a bunch of testing and we feel like that's the most robust. And so we calculate ET, evaporation from the intercepted canopy water, transpiration, and bare soil every single time step. And so that's what we use. That's what the comparison is, and sublimation from snow. That's what the comparison is that you see aggregated up that we compare to open ET.
So do you have a conclusion that what the temperature relationship to the evaporation rate?
Oh, sure. So as temperature increases, that's one of the components that increases your potential evaporation, right? So because we use MO similarity theory, it's basically a gradient-based approach, right? So it's really driven by the humidity gradient between the lower atmosphere and either the plant or the soil, with a resistance formulation in between, which is standard for all Earth system models. And so as you increase the temperature, and we recorrect humidity for the increased temperature. As you increase the temperature, you increase the evaporative demand, but you don't necessarily increase the actual evaporation or actual transpiration because that's dependent on a water limitation. And so what we see in the upper Colorado is that in convergent zones, groundwater is actually subsidizing transpiration even when soil is incredibly dry. And that's something that we've seen in our field site as well. And so, it's a very complicated relationship. And so that's why if you just increase, one of these factors, it doesn't necessarily mean that you directly get a change in evaporation. It's all of these interconnected processes. And then if you dry out or if you lower the water table depth, then you would limit evaporation. So eventually, that's sort of what I showed in Laura's paper, that in areas where you're already dry, you don't have as much change in evaporation versus areas where you're wet, where you actually have more water to give. And then over time, as you dry down these systems, they have less plant available water, and so they have less water that they're able to provide to meet the atmospheric demand.
Okay. Yeah, so I heard that people tend to use that very deep reservoir instead of shallow reservoir. Will that improve the drought situation a little bit more?
Very deep reservoir versus a shallow reservoir? Do you mean surface reservoir, or what do you mean by reservoir?
Reservoir means just pretty small in the surface, but pretty deep in the bottom.
Oh, yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
In terms of like water storage.
Yeah.
Yeah, to minimize evaporation. I mean, I know there's work on that, but that's not something I'm completely familiar with.
Thank you.
If there's other, Caitlin?
Yeah, this is kind of a CISL-ish question, but I'm curious, so you talked about kind of building projects and collaborations in other parts of the globe, right? And conceivably, like, access to technology and computational and data resources is quite different. I'm curious, like, what, if any, challenges you've experienced in building those, kind of up from the, like, technology side of things, and if you have any, like, I don't know if there's anything exciting from, like,
that's
certainly,
That's a terrific one, and so I can highlight this most recent one. So Maria is Brazilian, but she's a PhD student at Princeton, but she actually pulled all of the water table depth information from a burgeoning database from Brazil. I happened to make a contact at an international conference. She followed up. The entire database was in Portuguese. Database was not in, it's great, I mean, they did work with what they had, but there was a lot of work just in assembling the data. And so I would say in that project, 80% of it was making connections, assembling the data, screening the data, filtering the data, all of these things was majority. The machine learning approach, while important, is the minority of the amount of work. Now, through that, we've then made some really great Brazilian collaborations and connections. And so I have a VSRC, which is an official Princeton visiting student, so PhD student at University of Sao Paulo, who starts next week at Princeton, is going to be spending a year building a hydrologic model of Brazil. Now, he's going to be bringing data with him. He's going to be running on Princeton clusters because we have more computational availability. And we're housing this in our data center. So it's sort of this collaboration where he understands, he knows where a lot of the data is, he understands the system hydrologically, hydrogeologically, and then that's something that would go with him when he comes back, when he goes back, right? So it's a real transfer, but it's also, enabling through a number of different things, through our expertise and track record in having done this in other places, but also in infrastructure and computing. And that's just one example, but that tends to be a common mode.
Yeah. Just to follow on to Caitlin's question, you said that groundwater is under-observed in the US, so I imagine it must be even worse in the global south.
It very much is, yeah. So we've been pulling together databases for India, so I have a postdoc who's sort of leading that. We've pulled together China, again through collaborations. And Africa. And Africa is going to be one of the toughest. And so it's the AMACatch program in Africa, continental West Africa, which continental West Africa is basically the same size as the US, and it's just, a piece of Africa, so Africa's huge. But, again, data is scarce, but what data we have, is really only through long-standing collaboration, or in AMACatch, this is a French IRD project, they've taken a lot of that data directly and have done so for more than 30 years. And so it's, it's a big effort and a big endeavor, so absolutely.
Okay. I noticed from your open source like GitHub of PowerFlow that it has a quite extensive list of collaborators and a long history of ongoing work. How do you believe you most effectively manage such a large community around the model? And from a research software engineering perspective, what do you think are the most important practices that should be prioritized to enable effective collaborative software development, as well as engage user community of your build tools?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. That's something I feel like now that you asked the question, I should have touched on. So we have been in version control for PowerFlow for a long time. And we were CBS in a local repository, then we were SVN on a managed repository, and then GitHub. GitHub's been about more than 10 years, maybe 12 years. Around the time that we jumped to GitHub, Carol Woodward, who's an applied mathematician, famous applied mathematician at Lawrence Livermore, drew up sort of a vision and community vision and almost like a constitution for PowerFlow for community development. At the same time, that was more on the scientific side. At the same time, we developed a series of best practices and have a lead maintainer, Steve Smith, who's also at Livermore. And so what we decided was that Stefan and I would sort of be the scientific leads. I think it's now Laura, Stefan, and I are the three scientific leads for PowerFlow. And then there are actually a host of sub-maintainers, some that are at JSC, the University Supercomputing Center at ULISH, and some that are at Princeton, and then some that are other places as well. And then we have really rigorous, and for a long time, we've had continuous integration, and we had a number of unit tests that then turned into the CI tests. And we have pretty strict governance, which has been painful at times, but it's been really important. So the fact that we have just one main version and that we've been able to make decisions about what goes into that version and how that works. And then we have a very active user community. We have a very active development community, and we meet monthly by Zoom to walk through issues. We keep track of these issues. We have a task board that keeps track of a bunch of the things and keeps track of our pull requests and things like that. And it's a lot of work. And so we use it, and I don't think we're doing anything that other platforms aren't doing. We're just, saying that a lot of these best practices, we're putting them into practice for Parflow, and combined that they've been really helpful. At the end of the day, it's still an interpersonal collaboration, type challenge that we, have navigated and by good communication and by good collaboration.
I think we can do one last question, maybe. We're already out of time, but it's fine, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great talk. I'm definitely more familiar with sort of the atmospheric models. I'm curious, one aspect there is just like being chaotic, very sensitive to perturbation. How much is that true for groundwater models? And then to what degree does that sensitivity from like a climate model projection factor in predictions from the groundwater, like when you look out to
No, that's
2050 or something?
So, great question. And so basically, do we have chaotic behavior? Fortunately, no. At least not that we've found yet. Do we have complex behavior? Yes, but it's not chaotic. And you can think of it as, we have a more diffusive system. And at least for water table depth, it tends to vary more in space than in time. So we do have temporal signals, and that's important, but it tends to be more of a spatial pattern. Now, in terms of how much does interactions with the atmosphere influence, or vice versa, how much does this sort of stability in the groundwater system influence atmosphere? That is a great research question, and that's something that the community is starting to work on. Andy Prine, who was here, has done a lot of really great work. He's now at ETH. He's still part of the community on this, and has done a lot of great work on this. Stefan's group has done a ton of great work on this. My group has done a little bit of work on this in coupled mesoscale models. But that's really, I think, the next frontier. So as we sort of show that we can do Earth system simulations with high-rise groundwater, with resolving these gradients and such, then we start to look at how much that influences climate and vice versa. And so absolutely, the chaos in the atmosphere has an effect. In all of the studies that we've done, we have to make sure they're robust. We do usually time-shifted initialization so that we have an ensemble and we represent the ensemble distribution and spread. And then we tend to look at, kind of robust behavior over all those ensembles. In terms of the feedbacks and things like that, it's still too early to tell in the research directions. But that's a great question. Thanks.
Well, let's thank Reed again for you spending time today. We also have the time to meet speakers, so any remaining questions go there. So, but yeah, thanks, Reed.
And thanks everybody online. Thanks for
So as I said, there's the meet the speakers. So if you have remaining questions, feel free to spend time in the chat room. And/or folks online, you can also join virtually into the conference meeting platform for that room as well if you'd like to ask any additional follow-up questions.